Welcome to the Radiant Energy Summit, where you learn the top insights and strategies for nurturing and optimizing your energy on all levels of your being. Our guest today is Rollin McCraty. Rollin is Director of Research at the Heartmath Institute and Professor at Florida Atlantic University. One of his primary areas of focus is the mechanisms by which emotions influence cognitive processes, behavior, health, and the global interconnectivity between people and Earth's energetic systems. He's been with Heartmath since its founding in 1991 and has worked closely with its founder, Dr. Childre, to develop Heartmath's research goals and has been instrumental in researching and developing the Heartmath system of tools and technology. He's been interviewed in many national magazines and television programs, and he's also been featured in many documentary films. His research on HRV, also known as heart rate variability and heart rhythm coherence, has gained international attention in the scientific community and is helping to change long-held perceptions about the heart's role in health, behavior, performance, and quality of life. He's one of the primary creators of the Global Coherence Initiative, or GCI, that studies the relationship between human and geomagnetic field environments and the interconnectedness of and communication among all living systems. We welcome you, Rollin, to our summit today.
Thanks, Paul. Great to be here.
So thank you as well. What started you in the study of the heart? How did you get into this field?
Well, I'll make a long story short. And the honest answer to that, Paul, is personal experience. At one time in my life, I was a bit of a serial entrepreneur and had started a company which became quite successful, and was looking for something a little bit deeper than just another sports car in the driveway, I guess you could say. And through some other friends, I met Dr. Childre, who's the founder of Heartmath, and we just hit it off. And he shared some of his work that he had been doing about the heart and new ideas about his experience of the heart that I tried in my own life. And I can honestly say that I gained more personal benefits in just a few months of these practices. And this is long before there was officially Heartmath or the techniques we have today, than I had in 15 years of my personal meditation practices and so on. So I kind of had a heart opening, and which guided me to sell that company and join up with Doc and many others in helping found Heartmath.
I love how you use that phrase, heart opening. That's great. So what's your passion for HRV in the heart? Like what keeps you going?
Well, okay, there's two different questions there. Passion for HRV, and just to give a very brief sketch here, in our early research, we're primarily a psychophysiology laboratory at that time in the early 90s. We started out by looking at what our take on the physiological correlates, I'll call them, the changes in the body that were associated with different emotional states, and had already been practicing some of the heart stuff for a couple of years prior to this, so had some intuitive guidance there and some self observations that helped guided some of that early work. So we put a little more focus on looking at the activity of the heart than I think most people were at that time. And we were also, I think, one of the very first, not the first, but certainly the early people looking at positive emotions, like appreciation, compassion, kindness, and so on, in terms of physiological correlates. And at that time, there were maybe 3 papers in the actual peer-reviewed research literature, very few. That's changed now since positive psychology movement, which came many, many years later. Anyway, what we found through those studies in those early years was that it was the rhythm of the heart, or what we call heart rate variability, the beat-to-beat change in heart rate, that was by far the most reflective of a person's specific emotional state. And that when people were genuinely, call them having heartfelt feelings of things like appreciation, love, compassion, and so on, that the rhythm of the heart dramatically changed, like literally the whole body flipped into a different functional state, which was really intriguing. And then so we followed followed the data, so to speak, and learned a lot more about heart rate variability, which was underlying this. And this is before it was even called heart rate variability. So we've been at this a while. In fact, we drew one of our a really impressive scientific advisory board during those years. And one of those people who's now passed, Dr. Don Singer, is credited with coining the term heart rate variability. So we had some really, we're really fortunate, and I really honor some of the early advisors we had that really helped guide some of our studies. And so I don't know, it's a kind of a long answer, but I hope that gives you a feel for why we use HRV. It's simply because we followed the data, and it just continues to prove to be a really beneficial thing to measure. And I kind of jokingly say, although it's not really a joke, that heart rate variability is really simple. It's looking at the beat-to-beat change in heart rate on a fine-tuned level, or you can spend your entire career trying to understand it and all the things that it's telling us about the inner functions of the body. And then the other part of your question was the heart, and I have to divorce that a little bit from HRV. HRV is a great tool, but what we're really exploring is ultimately what we would call heart intelligence and the deeper understandings of the heart past its role as just a physical pump, which it probably actually isn't in reality a physical pump anyway, but that's certainly the kind of common mindset of the heart. So we're looking into the heart's role in, for example, in intuition and how it there's deeper, I call it deeper rooms of the heart that we can learn to access in terms of accessing the deeper part of ourself, of who we really are, at our more fundamental core levels.
Yeah, there's so many levels that our mind may not understand and the heart has access to. And that's just so cool that you guys found. I love how you said, Rollin, how we followed the data. So for those of us that need proof, like, does it exist, or how can you show the rhythms? Well, they're there. And even cardiologists now that have open minds and of course open hearts, they are using HRV. Like Ari Goldberger is one example, and so many of them now are beginning to kind of catch up to we've been reading ECG for a long time, but now there's these rhythms in between. And can you explain a little bit more about what HRV actually kind of does for us in layman's terms? In other words, we get kind of the concept of there's a beat to beat, and then there's an interval. But what about that interval? Why is it so magical?
Yeah, so when we're talking, HRV is technically, quite literally, the measurement of the intervals or the time between each pair of consecutive heartbeats. So, and that's of course derived from the electrocardiogram or the pulse, which correlates exactly with the electrocardiogram if we measure the pulse wave at the earlobe or fingertip or whatever, however one gets the data. And as it turns out, the range or the amount of this beat-to-beat variation or variability between heartbeats is naturally occurring. We always have it. We have it all the time, whether we're sleeping or climbing a mountain or whatever. This variability is going on. And there's two levels of it. I'll try and make simple here. One is how much of it do we have, this variation in heart rate variability. And we have more of it when we're young, and it gets less as we age, this natural HRV. So that you can think of that just setting still here now. If you're in your 30s, your heart rate is probably going up and down just naturally with about a 30 beats per minute change. So it might be from 60 to 90, and then 90 back to 60, and just kind of up and down and around within that range. And if you're getting older like I am in your 60s, it might be half that. So that's kind of a way you can kind of think about the how much of it issue. Now, as it turns out, the decline in this naturally occurring HRV is very much related to the aging process. So almost a linear relationship. The older we get, the less of it we have. So it's currently one of the best measures of the aging process. And so that allows us to see, if we have a lot of accumulated stress and trauma in our life, these kinds of things, we would have lower levels of HRV or amounts of it than we should have for our age. And that one of the reasons that cardiologists and more health professionals are really interested in getting into HRV is we now know that if it's lower than it should be for your age, that is a really important risk factor for future serious health problems.
Right.
In fact, your HRV, if it gets low, and we've seen cases, we do a lot of analysis for clinics all around the world now, that low HRV will show up oftentimes, in some cases, a year or two before the symptoms show up.
Yeah.
So it's a great early warning indicator that something's amiss. So we could call it as a measure of our health status or our functional status or our biological aging. They're all interrelated concepts that HRV reflects. Now that's one level. The next level has to do with not so much how much of it we have, but what is the rhythm that is beat out by the heart. In other words, this is where our picture's worth 1,000 words. So if we actually plot the beat to beat change, which is what underlies the heart rhythm. So if for now, Paul, if we didn't have any beat to beat change, if the time between each pair of heartbeats was the same, there would be no heart rhythm. The heart would be like a metronome, which is clearly not.
Right.
And that's what's not good, right? A metronome heart is get to the doctor quick because something's really wrong. But so the rhythm, when you look at the rhythms, the plots of them, this is where our early work really uncovered this, was that if we're feeling an emotion like frustration or impatience or anxiety or overwhelm, these types of feelings, that is reflected in the heart rhythm as a very chaotic looking rhythm. When we call that an incoherent rhythm is the term we've assigned to that, again, back in the early 90s. Whereas if we're feeling something like, appreciation or compassion, these types of, or patience, these type of emotions, the heart rhythm dramatically changes into, you could imagine, kind of like a sine wave or a smooth rolling hills kind of graph in this repeated pattern. And that is important because that is reflecting these rhythms, how synchronized the activity in our brain and nervous system ultimately is, and the communication between the heart and brain. So that was kind of neat to have that observation and see that we had a measure of emotional states, that looked, so frustration looks different than anxiety and so on. And the next kind of unfoldment of that research path was then, well, this is pretty cool, but so what? Is there a physiological reason that this is happening? And as it turns out, it's a big answer. The answer to that is yes, a big yes. And a lot of people don't know that the heart literally sends more neural information to the brain through the nervous system than the brain sends to the heart. And this is not some new discovery. This has actually been known for a long, long time, since at least the late 1800s. It's basic anatomy, just forgotten and ignored. But even before we came along, there was a whole body of research showing that, we'll call it the quality of these signals being sent from the heart to the brain, which is reflected in the patterns that I was describing earlier, have profound influences on our brain. And so over many years now that the mechanisms of all this has been worked out so that we have pretty clear understanding. But so when we're in an incoherent heart rhythm state, that basically those neural signals go to a part of the brain called the thalamus. And one of its roles is to synchronize the electrical activity of all the neurons in the brain. So when we're in an incoherent state, it basically inhibits or interferes with the synchronization of the neurons in the brain. And the term given to that back in the 1970s, that this effect, before the mechanisms were really understood, was called cortical inhibition. The cortex, the part of our brain we get paid to go to work for, is inhibited. And the way this manifests in day-to-day lives for many people, I'm sure not you, you've probably never had this experience, Paul, but where you get kind of frustrated at somebody or a little mad at them, and then you blurt something out, and then you're asking yourself about 30 seconds to a minute later, oh my God, I can't believe I just said that. Where was my brain?
We've all had that.
Right. So that's a great example of cortical inhibition. And that usually creates more stress when we say that thing we regret and it didn't really mean, probably, a lot of times. Whereas if we're able to be and that's a result because what's happening now, again, we know the mechanisms quite clearly now, the neural systems in our frontal and prefrontal cortex, which is really where the human capacities of foresight come from, the ability to understand how our actions and behaviors in the now will affect the future. So planning, goal setting, appreciating of, accomplishing a goal, abstract thinking, these are all, and discrimination of appropriate behavior, these are all frontal cortical areas. So those are more refined skills and capacities, and the neural mechanisms that underlie those, if they're out of sync, they're taken offline. They just don't work well. Is the kind of a simple way of understanding this, what's going on. Whereas if we're in a coherent state where the heart rhythm is coherent, that same neural signals are going to the thalamus and actually facilitate those same neural systems. So we're able to think clearer, we have faster reaction times, and a whole list of benefits like that. So that perceptually, there's more time, it feels like, inside of us between the thing that happens in the external world, that when we react to it and we blurt out the thing that we regret later. So we were able to bring more consciousness in and make a better choice in those moments. For just one example here. Hoping that made sense the way I explained that.
Total sense. In fact, some people, as they're listening to this, if they're taking notes, if they're just kind of like wondering, okay, so what does this mean to me? One of the many answers could be that if I do lose my temper, or if I do get into stress mode, I might see that there's number one, something I can do about it. I could actually objectively measure this. Wow, that's cool. Number two, I could do something about it in terms of the best biofeedback system I feel known to man, the body, and of course the center of it is the heart. And so we're in this golden age. That's what I consider that we're doing right now. We're in a new renaissance where we're relearning or understanding things that the ancients knew, and now we're, as you know, you're front and center with the technology that can help us remember it, how to tune into this incredible biofeedback system known as the mind-body, and it's just too cool. So how do we use HRV in our lives? And in other words, like it's super practical with all the experience that you've had, Rollin, over the years. How do we start plugging in HRV awareness?
Well, you just mentioned probably for the highest ratio of people, the best benefit they can get is we now have, and others too now kind of copy this, very inexpensive devices that allow you to see your heart rhythms or your HRV in real time, which allow people to really practice skills to manage stress or to increase performance, whether that's athletic or lower their blood pressure or whatever their goal is. All benefits from learning how to shift the rhythms of the heart into this more coherent state. So a great tool for helping learn how to do that is one of them is called Inner Balance. That's the one that works with smartphones, Android or iOS devices. A little sensor you just put on your earlobe, and it sends the data to an app on your phone, and then you can practice some of the Heartmath self-regulation skills while you're getting the feedback. So you're learning how to shift into that coherent state. And by the way, another neural pathway that I should have mentioned earlier is, I talked about the thalamus, but there's also one to the amygdalas. So the way the brain is really working to a large degree is interpreting the signals that's being sent from the body, but especially from the heart, and actually creating the textures, what we feel internally of an emotion. So when the body is working together, the systems in the body are working harmoniously together, which we mean by as coherent, the brain interprets that as we feel good.
Yeah.
So using these same techniques, you're actually able to much better manage your emotional state and your emotional diet, as I like to call it. So that's another kind of aspect of this. So that's a great training wheels, if you will, is getting the feedback as we learn to practice the techniques. And two things are going on as we just kind of practice with the feedback of coherence, is you are training your nervous system to where coherence is a more familiar state, because the brain likes things that are familiar. I won't go into all the details here, but so we're establishing that as a new inner reference that the brain then tries to maintain. And that's when it really becomes transformational and more automatic. So that's one level. But then it's also given us a tool set to use in day-to-day life when we hit, I'll call it the traffic jams of life, both figuratively and literally, where a lot of people lose it and start getting frustrated and impatient and so on, which all that does is drain our energy, our personal energy. So certain emotions, I'm not saying they're good or bad, but like things like impatience and frustration and so on literally create changes in the nervous system and hormonal system that just drain a lot of our energy. So we're exhausted or tired, more tired than we would have had to have been at the end of the day. whereas other emotions create different hormonal patterns and different rhythms that actually conserve energy and add energy to our system. So in terms of the theme of your telesummit here, it's so important to learn how to self-regulate and manage our energy, both our energy expenditures, how we're expending our precious energy throughout the day, but also how to recharge our inner batteries, which is being in a coherent state is helping recharge ourselves. So we have more mental, emotional, and physical energy to navigate the day-to-day life.
So we've talked earlier, Rollin, about how this biofeedback system known as the body has these other systems, and some of the big ones are the autonomic nervous system, the SNS, the PNS, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about, even though those of us that are not scientists, that are not doctors, that we're now beginning to look into that world saying, yeah, I've got systems inside of me. I've heard about the fight or flight thing. Maybe you can share a little bit about the sympathetic nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system, because even though I wasn't into science at all, suddenly this whole field fascinates me, not just because of the systems themselves, but the heart is the regulator, as you've said. So can you share a little bit about what the autonomic nervous system,
Sure.
et cetera, and how it works for us common everyday folks?
Sure. And by the way, the heart rate variability we were talking about is ultimately an indicator or a measure of the activity and the dynamic interaction of the autonomic nervous system. That's what it's the window into. So the autonomic nervous system is really important. It's the system that is taking care of well over 95% of the body's internal function at a high level of the hierarchy of control in the body of all the things we don't think about. What a crazy life it would be if we had to remember to breathe, right? Or regulating hormones and immune system and all the different things that are going on automatically, so to speak. Hence the name autonomic nervous system. And this autonomic nervous system is divided into two main halves or branches, and they have different roles and come from different places in the brain, have different neural pathways, and so on. The sympathetic one that you mentioned is the one that speeds things up if it has more activity going down it. So if we have to climb some stairs or are going to go play sports or whatever, we more activate the activity in the sympathetic system. So it would increase the heart rate, for example, speed up heart rate from a resting state to a higher heart rate. It talks to the adrenal glands and tells the adrenal glands to secrete more of the hormones needed for energy utilization. In other words, we're going to be expending more energy, and so on. Now that's the system, the sympathetic, that back in the late 20s and early 30s, the term fight-flight was coined, and to describe kind of the behavioral responses of sympathetic activation. In other words, if we encounter a challenge and we need to we're going to fight something for survival or whatever, or run away, that's the sympathetic system that gets strongly activated. So we have that energy to either engage in the fight or run away. It kind of one of my pet peeves. I hear all these stress management courses these days about this bad guy sympathetic system that's overactive and so on, and hijacks us and all that. And evolutionary, it was there so we could run away from tigers, and so on in the jungle. I don't know. I'm well into my 60s now, and I've yet to have to run away from a lion or a tiger. But they're modern day. So fight and flight is a real response. It just manifests in our modern world in different ways, in defensiveness, in arguing, in sabotaging others, and all of these kind of ways is the sort of the modern day version of fight or flight. But my main message here is the sympathetic system itself is not a bad guy. We really need it. When we engage in the world, we have to do stuff, right? You need the heart rate to go up, and you need the energy to be able to do things.
Yes.
So, we need to make it not a bad guy anymore. So the parasympathetic is the other half, and that comes down. By the way, the sympathetic are neural pathways that go down the side of the spinal column and go off to all the glands and organs and so on. The parasympathetic is the system that basically slows things down, is restorative. It's more active when we're resting or sleeping or socially engaging, these types of things. So it slows heart rate, for example. Whereas the sympathetic talks more to the hormonal system. The parasympathetic is more communicating with the immune system. So it has a lot of regulatory crosstalk there and regulatory factors. And it's the nerve pathway of it is what are called the vagus nerves. These are very large nerves that come down through the front of the body. And the parasympathetic nervous system is also what underlies what's called the social engagement system. So in reality, we don't just have fight or flight responses. Maybe if you're a rat in a cage or something, or out in nature, that's kind of your primary mode is, fighting, fleeing, this type of thing. But as humans, we have the ability to, if we're in an interaction and Paul, you say something I don't like, I have more options than hitting you or running away from you, right? We can self-regulate, and that's the parasympathetic nervous system that gives us that capacity. We can and that's why it's called the social engagement system, because I can self-regulate, slow the heart rate down if I'm starting to react, and say, wait a minute, let's talk this out, Paul. We might agree to disagree, but we don't have to, be enemies or something.
Good.
It's that parasympathetic that gives us that capacity.
Yeah, that's good.
And it's also very involved in restoring energy, as I was kind of alluding to earlier. So these two systems, in fact, why heart rate variability is so useful is it gives us a window into the activity of these two systems in real time. So a kind of a way of thinking of it, when we see these really chaotic, incoherent heart rhythms, that's telling us that those two nervous systems are out of sync with each other.
Yeah.
And that the higher brain mechanisms that are driving the activity in the nervous system are not functioning well together. They don't have a kind of a harmonious alignment in their functional state. And that's why you see these very chaotic looking heart rhythms. Our system's literally desynchronized in a energy inefficient state or mode. Whereas when we're in a coherent state, you have the opposite. The two nervous systems are now working more harmoniously together. So it's a much more efficient energy system that, I'm talking about our body now when I say that. So we're not using nearly as much biological energy and resources to get the same amount of work done. So it's a highly efficient state and mode to be in. So I don't know if I've answered your question or not. Hopefully, to somewhat, without getting into too detailed.
It's wonderful, and I'm just writing something down now. So coherence, you tell me if this is accurate, Rollin, equals the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic are working together in tandem. In other words, like they're in agreement.
Yeah, they're working more harmoniously in a cooperative way rather than a non-cooperative way. I
Good.
guess you could say.
Yeah, some of our other speakers have talked about how the prefrontal cortex, in other words, the part of us that gives us this will, this ability to make choices, to look into the future, like you said, to make plans, whenever we're kicking into this stress mode, and again, I agree with you. I don't think the sympathetic nervous system is some bad guy. I think it kicks in when it's supposed to. But the problem is if we're in constant stress, we're starting to burn out. And of course, that's affecting our heart rhythms. So what a great feedback tool now that we have that you have. It's kind of cool for you, Rollin, because it's ambient for you now because you're seeing it in your environment all the time. You've been tracking yours for how many years? Over 20 years now?
Yeah, probably close to 30.
Yeah, so you're used to it. And so for those of us, though, that don't have that same kind of feedback, not only is it new to us, when we start, a lot of our friends that have started tracking their HRV have started thinking like, okay, maybe something's wrong with me because they don't see coherence. They don't see their HRV being high enough. And I said, no, you're missing the point. The point is, it is a wonderful feedback tool. That's your day one benchmark. Even your day 30 benchmark is just starting out in a way. Maybe you can talk to us about some of these rhythms as we step back from like focusing on the numbers. That's something.
Yeah. So there are a lot of, we had the first HRV biofeedback system I think ever for the consumer. We sort of invented the field, and there are a lot of people jumped on that bandwagon in recent years, and a lot of different apps out there. And a lot of them, not all, but a lot of them are measuring how much variability you have and kind of trying to track that day to day, which I personally don't think is that useful. Whereas the Inner Balance app is really feeding back how coherent or incoherent is the rhythm, which is a completely different window into what's going on in our body than the how much question.
Yes.
Practicing coherence, we're not going to walk around in a heart rhythm coherent state all the time. It's not about that. It's more when we're practicing techniques to get us more coherent, and that takes time to train the nervous system so that becomes a more familiar and automatic state. Because if I'm out in the yard running around or climbing stairs, we wouldn't expect you to have coherent rhythms because of physiology always trumps. You've got these exquisite moment-to-moment, beat-to-beat changes in blood pressure, all things that have to go on to sustain energy regulation that are going to overcome the subtleties of the emotional state. But when we sit down and we're kind of quiet, then that's when that is more reflected. But by practicing regular practice of being in a coherent state, using a technique to get there in this coherent state, like I said earlier, Paul, you are training the nervous system, so it's the familiar, more automatic state. And that's really important because when we are in a stressful situation, the traffic jam or in the staff meeting, that person that always does that thing does it again, and it triggers our histories, and there we go. Being able to self-regulate in that moment is really the key, and that's when this stuff becomes transformational. But it would be naive to think we can all just shift to coherence when we're reacting if we haven't built that inner baseline and familiarity, which makes it much easier to shift into the coherent state when we really need to. So we don't say that stupid thing that we were talking about earlier, or have that automated behavioral response that just causes more stress in our life and wastes energy. So we become more conscious, more intelligent about our choices and our behaviors and actions.
Yeah, I'm just kind of taking this in now because I'm feeling like I'm almost vicariously experiencing what what we as humans do. This is no judgment here. Like, in other words, like we're watching the TV news and we're hearing about this political system challenge. We're hearing about what's going on in another country or what happened down the 10 o'clock news issues, and that has a tendency by design in many cases to kick us up into SNS, sympathetic nervous system activity. So that gets our attention. The old phrase, if you want to keep people in fear, you can control them, And what's cool about today is we can step back from these things with all the wonderful tools, including Heartmath, to self-regulate, as you're saying it, and step into our higher order functions where we're capable of being, Rollin. That's what I feel is one of the coolest parts of what you do is you're helping people have those truly transformational experiences while they're ostensibly tracking their heart rhythm,
Yeah. Right. If I just add to that, if I may, that historically we've focused a lot here at Heartmath on the tools and techniques in our training programs and courses and books and so on managing our emotions. And the reason for that is because the emotions that we experience are the primary drivers of the activity in our nervous system and our hormonal systems.
Yes.
They run the show. We like to think it's our thoughts and that we can think ourselves out of stress, but it just doesn't work. That's not the way the body's designed. That's easy to prove here in the lab. I can have you wired up to all this, wild equipment we've got, measuring your brain waves and your blood pressure and your heart rates and skin conductance and all this stuff we do. And having you thinking, and doing serial subtractions and all this kind of stuff, not much really happens in terms of changes in physiology. But once you trigger an emotion, once you feel something, positive or negative, big, rapid changes happen quickly. So there's no question that emotions run the show. And it's through the emotional mismanagement that people are really wasting a lot of their life force and their day-to-day energy. All the extra drama we put into things and the over-significance and over-cares and all this stuff that are really eating the life force out of humanity. So that's why we've really focused so much on the self-regulation of our emotions, but self-regulating not out of duty or because I said so or some guru or something said that, but out of our own inner intelligence that it's just a thing to do for our own personal health and come out and performance. And then it becomes self-motivating, and it's not something people are ever going to do out of do good, just not. But once we really get how it, for our own intelligence, from our own intelligence, then it really becomes, like I said, transformational. And another thing I would suggest here, where our more current research is, Paul, is when we talk about emotions, they're not something that just stays inside of us. Now, that may sound crazy, but our emotional experience does affect others, not just through body language and our behaviors, but through what I'm going to call the energetics now. So, for example, what I'm talking about here is when the heart beats, it also creates a magnetic field. And I'm not talking about an aura here. I'm not saying that auras don't exist. I just can't measure them in the lab yet.
Yet.
So when you go to the doctor, they measure your electrocardiogram, and they put electrodes across your chest or across your brain, whatever, to measure brain waves. What is being measured there is the flow of current. That's why it's called the electrocardiogram, right?
Yes.
But whenever we know that there's a flow of current, just basic physics, 101 is that you create a magnetic field. So almost every teaching hospital these days has equipment to measure the magnetic field of the brain and heart. So one of the things about the magnetic field that's generated, and you need a different device. You can't measure those with electrodes with the electrocardiogram. You have a device called a magnetometer. So with today's equipment, we can measure the magnetic field produced by the heart about 3 feet away from the body. It goes farther than that, of course. That's just the sensitivity of the instruments and the background noise and so on. The same instrument, you can measure a brain wave about an inch away. So you get the difference energetically. The heart's clearly the big player here. Now, the pulsing magnetic field is carrying information about our emotional state. And we've actually proven this, and we use spectral analysis techniques, and you can actually see that the information carried by the magnetic field of the heart is quite different if we're frustrated or impatient and so on versus in a coherent state, feeling like appreciation or love and so on. So it's just like a cell phone, right? We use an electromagnetic field to carry the information, your voice, the text message, whatever. So it's the information riding on the field that's different, and that's for sure. We know that emotional information is being carried by the heart's magnetic field, probably much more, but for sure we know that. So then the next question was to ask, and this is back in the 90s still, was okay. So we know that the heart's radiating a field. We can measure it, right? That's not debatable, and we can see and measure the different information being carried by the field. Does that affect other people? Are our nervous systems a detector of this? And the answer there is clearly yes. And we published a number of things about this as well. So our nervous systems, as it turns out, are exquisitely tuned to other biologically generated rhythms and frequencies. So there's basically, without going into all the scientific, rigor and detail here, there's a lot. But what this is showing us is that there is truly an unseen and largely unconscious for most people energetic communication that's going on between people in social situations or in couple relationships, whatever. And I think this helps explain a lot of the things in our language where people have instinctively known this, forever in a way, or intuitively known it. Like the tension was so thick in the room you could cut it with a knife. Some of these kind of sayings in our language. Or, God, that really felt good to be around that person. I was just vibing with them. These kinds of sayings.
Yes.
Actually, we're now starting to see have scientific validity and measurability. So this comes into part of our more work these days on what we call social coherence. So coherence is a term that just is a measurement of how ordered and harmonious the different parts of the system are working. And in this case, we can do that at the group level as well, or within two people or more. How coherent is the relationship and the energetic communication and these different factors that are going on within the group. Which then, in our other side of our research, which is global coherence, you mentioned that in your introduction, is how are the magnetic fields of the heart and brain coupling with the Earth's magnetic fields and feeding information into that larger field, which then affects all living systems within the larger field. So that's kind of the three levels we're really looking at, and on how our emotions don't just affect what our processes and our internal nervous system, hormonal system, and so on, but how they actually impact others in a real and measurable way, and potentially even the global field environment.
So it gives us insight. In other words, sometimes, as I shared with a friend this morning, The drive to do something may not always be strong enough to do it for ourselves, but when someone else is involved, we might just up our not just motivation, but our inspiration to do it. Like what kicks us into, let's say, giving love to another might be more than we would love ourselves. And
yeah, some people, yeah.
Yeah, what I love about what you're saying is that now, since we know there's this unseen heart field, as I was just kind of writing little notes while you're talking, that knowing that my field affects someone else, I don't want to bring a negative energy into that state.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, I mean, and that's great, and I appreciate that you're more evolved there, and that you care about that. And of course, it works both ways. I mean, I think everybody who's worked in a company or a group, it seems like there's usually at least one person that could care less about that. It might be upset, angry, whatever, and wants you to know it and wants you to feel that way with them. It can really disrupt team dynamics or family dynamics.
Well, when we look at David Hawkins' work, when he measures consciousness, etc. I mean, most people, 99% of the world's population, actually are good people, at least that much. And there's just a small fraction that, for whatever reason, they've been abused as children. Their hearts have been hurt. Their minds are still carrying old things. The old, the body, the cellular memory kicks off when they're triggered. And so I think most people have the intent of going to work in a good state. It just so happens that once in a while something does get triggered when our stress levels get a little too high, when we reach that overwhelm level, and then the sympathetic nervous system kicks in. The real key, Rollin, as you know, that it kicks in longer than it's intended to. I think that's one of the real things we're learning now through the feedback we're getting. Our bodies are giving us feedback, and then we've got things like HRV that give us maybe a little bit more objective feedback, because isn't it crazy that sometimes we're not trusting our own body signals, but we'll trust somebody else saying your heart's out of rhythm or your HRV's off, or it's wild. We are very fickle beings in that respect.
True.
We spoke earlier about a phrase, the gift of being out of coherence.
So let me say this a different way. What I'm referring to there, that it's not about always walking around in a HRV coherent state in terms of these nice pretty sine waves, because physiological activity will override the subtlety of the emotional factors there. But what we actually teach in our training programs, especially our ones for teams and groups and more in the social coherence, is that we can still be operationally coherent, is the term we use, where we really are in charge of our emotions and in our consciousness, in our inner vibratory state. So in practicing physiological coherence, or the HRV coherence, is a great way to stabilize the nervous system, really get our things in harmony. And we can learn to maintain that, even though the heart rhythms may not be exactly coherent when we're engaging, but we can still maintain that emotional composure and that alignment with our heart's intelligence, even as we engage in day-to-day stuff.
Yes.
So it really is about the practices really are about increasing the ratio of our, we'll call it operational coherence throughout the day, and really increasing our consciousness and awareness in day-to-day life, although our physiological heart rhythms may not always be coherent.
Yes, yeah. And I'm just thinking back when I first started using Heartmath and HRV back about 10 years ago. And my partner, who was, like in coherence, like most of the time, I would start comparing mine versus hers, which is inappropriate to do. It just doesn't make sense. But I also remember, Rollin, that I was having a stressful thing going on in my family system. My mother was on her way out of this world. She was having, not ironically, atrial fibrillation heart issues, which taught me tremendous amounts. That's why this is one of the big reasons, Rollin, that I love this work so much, a study of the heart, because it directly affects all of us. And so the second part of my experience is that when I started using the first Heartmath app before it became Inner Balance, I started getting a little bit of a vibe, like, you know what, I feel a little bit more calm today. And so even as people first start tracking, the point of this is, even if you're not in the coherence that you want to be, it's still a great feedback tool. So then
absolutely.
You can step back, learn. You're calling it training the nervous system. I think that's fantastic that you've coined that, because it's a way of getting a reference point. Day one, check in, during the week, check in 30 days from now, and see that your resilience is actually increasing, your emotional resilience, so to speak. So
yeah, that's a great thing to do. And in the inner balance and pretty much all the different devices, you have the capacity to track your coherence levels, when you're practicing, and see how hopefully they do improve where you're more and more coherent over time. And what I recommend for people when they're using a device like that, yes, do some practice on your own, get where you can, establish and maintain coherence for, a few minutes. But then practice, don't necessarily just go for higher numbers. I mean, that's fine, but the real world practice I recommend is, okay, so now you're off doing a heart meditation or something, and you can maintain nice coherent rhythms for 3 minutes, 5 minutes, whatever. Then now can you do it while we're having a conversation?
Yeah, real
Not
world.
necessarily running around, but you can learn to do that.
Yes.
And because that's really what this is about, is taking it into life. Okay, now you can do it while we're having a nice, casual conversation. Can you do it when maybe when you're on the phone with that person that just triggers you, and maintain that coherence and composure then? And yes, you can learn to do that, and that's really what I'm talking about, is that operational coherence, and how we really elevating and uplifting our inner vibratory state, our consciousness, and increasing our awareness, so that we're making better choices, and how about not only about how we're expending our own energy, but how we're interacting with and how we're affecting others in the world. So we're more inclusive of our choices and in life, and just how we navigate day-to-day life.
And we could call that practical coherence, because I remember something you said when we've spoken earlier, and that is that the choice you made to leave your company, to sell it, move into the work you're doing now, is you realized not only was it a wonderful practical shift, but it had a qualitative difference in your life. So it's both. You feel better on the inside, and you make better decisions. Let's touch on some of the things that you shared before, Rollin, about how tuning into your heart balance, your heart coherence, is not just practical, but it increases this ability to sense things. That the heart has this sensing ability that you've talked about before.
Okay, you're talking. Yeah, I think you're talking about the intuition research. It was a whole another chunk of our few years of our work. And what got us started down that path, Paul, was so many people that were practicing the Heartmath skills in their life were coming back. I don't just mean one or two. I mean, it was just lots and lots of people saying, hey, I'm getting all these great benefits. My blood pressure is lower. I'm not getting pissed off in traffic as much, blah, 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 on and on. But the thing that's really standing out is my intuition. It's just like on steroids. And then the second thing they would say, in synchronicities. I've got a problem. I'm thinking about something, and just so-and-so calls, or I run across a magazine article that just has the answer I'm looking for. It's just out of hand, obvious difference in what it used to be. So we developed some protocols and things for measuring these kind of intuitive capacities. And I'm going to skip forward now and say that what we really see is that there are three primary types of what people call intuition. And it's helpful to understand the different types before I go too much farther. And so the first type is called implicit learning or implicit knowledge. And this is the type of intuition that's mostly studied in academia and so on, because it's safe. And it's where the brain has learned something and forgot it learned it, or didn't know it learned it. And it's an unconscious kind of implicit memory. That's why the term implicit. And we encounter a situation or a problem, and the brain is doing this automatic pattern recognition or matching to these unconscious memories, and we have the insight. There's a lot more to it, but that I think will give you the idea. And the reason it's safer in academic circles and so on is it's all about the brain and unconscious memories that we're pattern matching to, and people can argue over the mechanisms of the pattern matching process and so on, and that's all fine. And it is an important aspect of our intuition, that leads to expert knowledge and things like this. The second type we call energetic sensitivity. And I kind of alluded to a little bit of this earlier, but this is our nervous system's ability to detect and respond to very real signals from the environment. And that could be the field from another person I was just talking about earlier, emotional states of others, and empathy are in this category, where we're actually able to feel this energetic communication between people. Other studies have been done. For example, you've probably had the experience, most people have, where you feel like somebody's staring at you. You turn around and sure enough, somebody's staring at you. A couple of studies have actually confirmed that that's a real sensitivity. That's a real measurable effect. Another example, some people really can feel an earthquake coming. And we now know that we can measure changes in the magnetic field environment of Earth that precede earthquakes. And there's absolutely no question that our systems, even though the mechanisms aren't fully understood yet, that we are sensitive to these larger Earth scale magnetic fields. There's absolutely no question of that our bodies detect that and respond to it. So that would be in that energetic sensitivity category. And the third category we call non-local intuition, which is really where a lot of our focus was around this. And these are the type of intuitions that you can't write off or explain away through the other two types. And many examples of this. Usually, if I'm doing a talk at a public forum or something, I'll ask, how many of your mothers? And okay, so how many of you have the sense of when your kids are up to no good, doing something they shouldn't be doing, or in harm's way, and they're on the other side of town or the other side of the planet, and about every mother raises her hand. And then a lot of times one of the kids, or if there's younger people, they say, yeah, I'm on the other end of that. She always knows, right? So that's not magic. There has to be a mechanism for that. Or another example that a lot of people have had is you're driving your car, you're going down a road, you've been down, hometown 1,000 times before, many thousands of times, but for some reason you slowed down, maybe even unconsciously, before you went over a hill or around a curve or something, and there was a child that run out into the street, or a traffic accident, or ice, or something that would have caused probably a problem if you hadn't done that.
Yes.
So these are just a couple of examples of this non-local intuition, which is beyond time and space, right? And in fact, it's pretty recognized in a lot of different areas. The armed forces, for example. In fact, the Navy put out research requests for some pretty substantial funding for this type of intuition last year, because there's so many examples and stories of how it saved people's lives in different situations. So we were able to develop some protocols to bring that into the lab and at least get some measurements around it. I won't go into the technical details, but very well thought out, very rigorous studies to basically see if we could measure this happen. First of all, that happening, but also when and where and how was the flow of these inner signals in the body. And I'll make a long story short, the heart was the first to get the signal. The heart then sent a different neurological signal to the brain. Then you had a brain response, all before the future event happened. And these are set up in computer trials and things with lots of trials. And then you had a body response where you felt it, the gut feeling of the hair on the back of the neck. So the gut gets all the credit, but it was really heart, brain, body. And if we're paying attention, then you had the intuitive feeling. So that was, and then we developed for other protocols. And this has been verified many times over now. In fact, even 2 different meta-analyses have been done of this type of research that are confirming that we indeed have this type of non-local intuition. I would suggest that we all have all 3 types. Some just are more grounded in one type than another, and some people are more balanced in all 3, and so on. But some of the protocols we did, and where I think this leads to your question, Paul, sorry if I'm being long-winded here, is when we take people through these rigorous protocols, if they're in a heart coherent state beforehand versus just in their normal state, the physiology is quite different. We see a much stronger opening, if you want. I'll use that word. It's not quite technically correct, but between the heart and the channel between the heart and brain. So you get a much stronger intuitive signal sent from the heart to the brain when you're coherent. And also being in a coherent state, if we're practicing that, it's also quieting to a large degree all the mental emotional noise that's usually kind of the quiet under the radar roar that's really going on in the background. That really drowns out the fairly loud intuitive signals that we just miss because there's too much noise and we're just not paying attention to them.
Yeah, I just love that.
And
no, that's perfect. And it reminds me of something that you and I have spoken before about the intuitive heart. And in your book, Heart Intelligence, you talk about in chapter 3, and I quote, "I realize that the lack of alignment between what our mind says and what our intuitive heart is quietly trying to tell us can be one of the biggest unrecognized sources of stress. Wow. I mean, that just says it right there.
And I'll stand by that. I would say that's one of the largest sources of stress on the planet in humanity in general.
Yeah. And so we're at this line, this inflection point. That's the way I kind of see it is that not only do we have these devices like Heartmath or these tools like Heartmath to help us become more aware, but we're also becoming more aware of our own awareness so that we can make different choices, that prefrontal cortex or our intuition or, there's all these things that we can call it, but how do you feel? You either feel good or you don't feel good. If you don't feel good, that tells you something's out of rhythm, And whether we're into the science with the left brain, whether we're into the other parts, it really kind of doesn't matter. It's like we want to be in flow. Everybody wants to feel good at some level, right?
Yeah,
and
sure.
It's beautiful that you're helping us remember how to get there more easily, so we can. It's not about just turning off the sympathetic nervous system, like you said before. It's about making friends with it. That's one of my intents and what I do in the stuff we.
Well, I would say, yes, that's true, but another level is pretty low down in the hierarchy. That the real game, if we really want to evolve in our consciousness, is learning to access the intelligence of the heart and take that seriously. Because when I talk about heart intelligence, I'm not using that as a metaphor. For example, the study I was just sharing you about, the way I got that published in the first studies we did in peer-reviewed scientific journals was to talk about the heart and brain, which came later. That it appears that they have access to a field of information that's outside the boundaries of time and space, what we would call a frequency domain in science. And that was perfectly acceptable language for scientific journals at that time, because things like entanglement and non-locality had been experimentally proven in quantum physics. There was no question that these are real things. We were just showing it in these wet, large biological systems, the same thing. And now, since in quantum physics, that's been blown past the subatomic level to groups of atoms and big groups of atoms, and it probably even people that this entanglement and non-locality occurs. We were just a little bit ahead of that curve, showing it the way we were. But what I really meant by that statement, if I unpacked it, and I'm a little bit more open about saying this now, when we think about, well, what the heck is a field of information outside the boundaries of time and space? I would say that's really what people have been describing in different ways in different languages for a long time. What was called the spiritual heart in some traditions, or the energetic heart, accessing your higher self in some of the more new age concepts, or larger self is what we call it here at Heartmath, or in more religious circles, the voice of the spirit, or our soul, connecting with our soul's wisdom. These are all things that have been said. Quantum physicist David Bohm talked about it as the implicate order. This is exactly what he meant.
Yes.
And I know that from having a conference here where he had just passed away, but one of his very close friends and collaborators was here, who said it's exactly what he meant, right? By that in a quantum physics language. So I'm just, in our work is just trying to say, hey, listen up here. The heart as a source of our higher capacity, intuitive intelligence, is not a metaphor. It's literal. Yeah. That is the doorway, the transceiver, if you will, to our larger self is the energetic heart.
Yes.
And it filters it down into the mind-brain physiological systems.
Couldn't agree more. Yeah.
So really learning to listen to that voice and follow that is way bigger than worrying about the sympathetic or the parasympathetic nervous system in terms of really navigating life from a new level, because that's what elevates consciousness as we learn to access and trust and that flow of intuitive guidance. So intuition, non-local intuition, the big game really is that flow of information from our larger self. That is the big game of intuition that I'm talking about. It's our inner guidance system, that really knows who we really are and what is really best for us.
Yes. And as my partner Susan Castle once said, your heart will never fail you. And we're talking about more than the human heart. It's this heart intelligence that you're touching on, and we as a culture are just really starting to understand it, and it's just a beautiful thing. I think the sages of all time, no matter how long ago they lived, they understood it, because when we read their stuff, we feel good. We feel the resonance.
If you're talking about, I call them signposts that have been here along the way, that
yes,
that we're more plugged into a higher vibrational consciousness.
Yes.
they pretty much all said the same thing. In fact, one of a scholar that used to work here at Heartmath, three PhDs, a UCLA professor who retired and came to work here, and one of his kind of passions was religious studies. And in fact, I need to track that down. He wrote a chapter that basically saying that the bottom line, the common theme, the most common theme of all the world's great religion and philosophical approaches is the heart, as the access point to courage, wisdom, information, the higher intuition, inner guidance. So whether that's Buddhism or the Arabic religions, Christianity, Judaism, it's the common theme in all of them, and as well as a lot of the great philosophers. It's always been about the heart. In fact, in Chinese medicine, chapter 1 in any book you read about it, talks about the heart as housing the mind and all that.
Yes.
So it's common globally across cultures and time spans. Heart. The Greeks, back to them, even.
And we're healing the split that happened a long time ago, the Cartesian split, things like that, where science and spirit were separated. And now it's like we're talking the same language now. Yes, what we feel can be proven, and that is so cool. So that's why it's so practical. And so we thank you, Rollin, for your time today. And how would you like to close? What kind of cool thing would you like to share with us as we ride out into
the last thing I would just kind of like to ask of the listeners to this would be that maybe you take a few moments throughout your day-to-day lives and take an inner pause, kind of, we call it a spot check, and just maybe ask yourself, what am I feeding the field, my personal field and the global field now, today? How much of it is really being kind, compassionate, appreciative, loving, versus how much am I feeding the field that has maybe frequencies of frustration or impatience, overwhelm, irritation, etc. And do that inner check, because it does matter. And if you are a little bit into the higher ratio of feeding the field more incoherence, maybe see if you can do an inner shift, do some heart focused breathing, activate a positive feeling, appreciation, compassion, kindness, and try and increase the ratios of radiating that into the field environment.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you, Rollin. Thank you for what you do, and thank you for your time today and what you're contributing, because you're answering the question. So what am I feeding the field? Well, you fed some wonderful stuff to us today, and our hearts we are satiated. So thank you, brother. We appreciate you and your wisdom.
Well, I appreciate you doing the interview and helping get the word out, Paul.
Thanks so much. With much aloha, Rollin.
Take care of yourself, and to all the listeners, have a great rest of your day.
Yes.